no. Who's opening?
You are open. You are open.
Am I?
Yeah, you are.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Today, I just want to say that we are really looking forward to the talk we're going to be given today by Stefan. But before we start, I would like to introduce the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, Prof. Margaret Chitiga Mabuku, to make the appropriate introductions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I was expecting a whole podium here, but anyway, I will make do without. So good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to everyone here, and those joining us online. I understand we have an audience online, so very warm welcome. It's an extremely exciting day today. I hope that everyone is just as excited about today's event, and we can't wait to listen to Professor Stefan Dercon. My phone. Give me a second, holding this, and then my speech is a little bit of a challenge here. Okay, maybe I should do this. My apologies. So of course, as you know, as you see in the program, Stefan will discuss with us some practical strategies for resilience and inclusive growth. And we know very well in South Africa, and beyond South Africa, we need to know this and to implement such strategies. As you know, South Africa has not been growing for decades and decades, and we are, of course, notoriously known as the most unequal country in the world. So this could have come at a better time. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, Stefan. I will introduce Stefan just now, but I just want to take a moment to say a few thank yous. Firstly, of course, to thank you, Stefan, for agreeing to do this keynote speech for us today, tonight. We're extremely privileged to have you here today. I also want to express our gratitude to the ERSA community and the leadership of ERSA. It is really because of them that we have this event and that they have funded this event. We're grateful, very grateful to you for this. Let me thank as well the CSAE team for agreeing to, firstly, to host this year in Pretoria, the pre-conference in Pretoria, but also for funding our colleagues coming from different African countries. We are extremely grateful for that. We also thank you for organizing this event, and I understand it's running perfectly and smoothly. Let me thank my own colleagues, because they must give me good evaluations as well. Nicola Viegi, Eleni, Carol, Nikki is there somewhere, I think was here, for organizing it, the logistics, making sure that everything runs smoothly here at Future Africa. I really want to thank you very much for doing that. Let me ask that we give these teams a round of applause, please. Thank you. Thank you very much for this. I want to thank as well the audience. Thank you everyone for being here, especially, of course, those who came especially for this function, but those of you who also been here for last 2 days or so, and will continue to be here for a few more days. But let me do my job now and introduce Stefan, because that's what we're waiting for. I just always have to do a little bit of something before I do my actual job. So Stefan's bio, as you can imagine, just the bio, is what, Stefan, 5 pages? So we're going to be here for a while. Bear with me. Anyway, no, Stefan has graciously said, please say 1 sentence about me. So I'll try to say very little about you, but it's impossible to say 1 sentence about Stefan. I think he doesn't need introduction, to be very honest. But let me do it for the sake of protocol, and because we are probably recording this session. So as you know, Stefan Dercon is a professor of economic policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and the Economics Department, and a fellow of Jesus College. He is also director of the Center for the Studies of African Studies, for the study of African economies at Oxford University. He is a professor in the economics department at Oxford University, furthermore. Over the years, Stefan has worked extensively as a policy advisor, providing strategic economic and development advice and promoting the use of evidence in decision-making, including serving as chief economist of the UK Department of International Development then between 2011 and 2017. Between 2020 and 2022, he was the development policy advisor to successive foreign secretaries at the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Stefan's research interests concern what keeps some people and some countries poor, the failures of markets, failures of governments, failures of politics in Africa mainly, and how to achieve change. I would guess that many of us have read his work and enjoyed his work. Without wasting any more time, please help me welcome Stefan to the podium.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you very much. I hope the microphone is clear and loud. Clear? Okay, good. That will help me. Well, thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Nicola, all the people also from the department here to just asking me to do this. I feel a bit embarrassed. I've talked about these things before, but maybe less so in the South African case. And so what I will be doing is telling a little bit also about something that's kept me busy over the last decades, which is, you know, I'm an academic. I try to answer small questions really well. That's what academics do. Very precise and ask them well, because you build that up. But once I was working in the policy environment, it is important to have a big picture view. You need to be able to begin to put it all together and having frameworks. Now, I don't think as economists we're necessarily that good at it. It's also, of course, very hard. So you kind of want to have thinking frameworks, and that's the kind of what I want to talk to you about. And I want to explain a way that I've begun to think about the world, about differences between countries and their progress in recent decades. And I will then be really something really tricky for myself, try to give an application to that, what I think maybe how I would think about South Africa. Now that's the outsider's view. You're the insider, so I'm the outsider. And I want to just say this is relatively speaking to so many other countries that I've looked at and tried to understand, where does it fit and what does it mean then? Okay, so don't expect from me to be the most precise economist or political scientist in talking about it, but I will try to talk about a framework that helps me and hopefully also helps some of you to think about different places, different times, different countries, and what keeps development from happening or what helps development from happening in some of these places. So let me start with some facts. You know, I started many decades ago now as a poverty economist. I was doing measurement, you know, and it was the time that we began to do this. And these are kind of exercises. This is the World Bank's global measurement of extreme poverty. The number of people living below that kind of line of $2.15 in 2017, PPP, and so on. You know, problems with it, but it's probably as good as we have to actually have a simple metric of comparison. And now we have this massive progress that's happened in the world, that actually since 1990, up to roughly now, we actually have almost a 2/3 reduction. You know, you see the little blip towards the end of it, COVID, where poverty increased again. We're roughly now again where we were at 2018, okay? But that's the kind of global numbers. Some more kind of issues with it. But what's really important is that green thing there is what happened in East Asia. We know that story. You know, China, about 800 million people in extreme poverty by 1990, and this massive progress. But not just China in Eastern or Southeast Asia, Indonesia as well making lots of progress. The blue one, we have South Asia. You know, we usually think that's India. Of course, for population, a big part is India, but there's also several hundred million people living in Bangladesh, where we also made a lot of this progress. And you see it came a bit later. It wasn't initially in the 90s yet, but after 2010, even though the percentage of people in poverty had been going down, it actually caught up with population growth, surpassed it, and then the numbers of extreme poor went down. But then we see the dark blue there, which is sub-Saharan Africa, which is the kind of story we have. But one of the amazing things in this period is that it actually provides a good illustration, that Africa is not a country, that actually there's heterogeneity. And in that period, if you look at the number of extreme poor people, you had some countries where the numbers doubled. You know, we could argue a little bit, and we could argue about the PPP and whatever it is, but they're close to doubled in places like DRC, Nigeria, Madagascar, nobody ever talks about it, but probably really staying behind and so badly governed. Malawi, a country without natural resources and without natural resource curse, and actually with a reasonably functioning democracy, and it's also one where it doubled. Okay? But then you had halving over a series of decades. In Ghana, partly catching up again what I had lost in the 1980s. Ethiopia also, of course, with its own issues now. South Africa, where does it fit in? In numbers, it's more or less stagnant. Of course, population has gone from 40 to 60 million above it, but it's now probably according to these measures, and we could argue again, but like from 14 to 12. It's actually somewhere in the middle there, okay? And so it's one actually where these things happening, the things have been happening. Now, that's a big picture, and we know that these things correlate strongly with growth, with basically what's been happening in economies. There's no economy in this, there's no country in this period where extreme poverty went down in a sustainable way without actually accelerating growth quite considerably. It's just not happened. It doesn't mean it's a sufficient condition, but there is no country where poverty went down dramatically across the world without actually also accelerating growth. And you see there some of these countries, and then you see, I put Thailand there because, by 1990, this is where South Africa was. And actually, Thailand went well ahead of it. We have Indonesia that was actually well below South Africa in that period, and it actually seemed to be catching up now to where South Africa is in GDP per capita. This is in constant dollars, not in PPP, so we could argue about it as well. And then you see countries, and in fact, lower middle income countries had a really good time then. About 2.8% growth per capita per year. If they had 3.5%, then GDP per capita today would be threefold than it was 30 years earlier, just from the compound interest. So that's actually like 2.5 times on average lower middle income countries had managed to increase then. Now, if I take simply that number of lower middle income, if I took a middle income, I think it's just over 3.1%, similar type of order of magnitude, you see there some of the winners that I put on the right there. You get the usual suspect, China, but actually quite a few of the others that actually there were quite important accelerations. And then there's a set of countries that stayed behind there, And then actually, I call them in inverted commas a bit losers. Nigeria, Pakistan, the DRC Congo. DRC Congo is actually now only about 2/3 of GDP per capita that it had at independence. So, that's really a dramatic decline. But DRC really, they're something happening. And South Africa, it's moved on, moved up a bit in that period. You could say quite remarkable, because if you compare it with the apartheid period, I think since 1960, it's 3 times as fast that its per capita growth was, but of course it's still incredibly low, especially given the type of period. And why do I kind of want to emphasize that period? Because that was quite a remarkable period when you look back at it. I was writing the book when it hadn't totally finished, but so roughly around the time of COVID I started writing this. But it's now very clear that the politics, the geopolitical and the geoeconomic situation in that period was quite remarkable. There was probably geopolitical, not non-polarity, that's clearly a type, geopolitical single polarity, maybe moving into not really a fight between polar groups. Maybe in one way you could say this was somehow the time that, at least as seen from a developing world, Francis Fukuyama, end of history, was maybe kind of okay. Because actually, it didn't really matter there was not really a dominant, everything had moved somehow to being dominated by a particular model. And of course, the one that we know very well then what happened in that period is globalization to trade and global demand growth that was happening. And actually it was a great time for global finance, also for development aid, because interest rates were low. It was a great, great period. I want to actually put this because, you know, for those countries that quote unquote lost in that period, stayed behind, it's a much harder period now. Now we have geopolitical multipolarity and basically creates all kinds of things that then actually creates the threats because trade wars, clearly not awake when I was writing that, trade wars happening and the risk of it, but also macroeconomic stresses. And similarly, finance has become expensive. You know, have lots of countries with debt and relatively high interest rates, and global finance that clearly begins to want something for it, and I think really it's there. But if you think of it, it was quite a remarkable period because this is actually more common in the last century or two, to be on the right-hand side. We had a kind of a remarkable period. So some countries took advantage and others not. And that was the question that I still want to ask, and I want to at some point try to actually say a few things, you know, where do I think South Africa fits into it? But why is it that some countries made substantial progress in this period and others not? So for those who want to blame global capitalism, the world sucks, I'm with you, you know, and Joe Stiglitz and everything. The global system is not favorable for global southern countries. But the interesting point is that despite this, some countries actually took advantage and others not. I want to understand not whether the system is biased against the global south. No, I want to actually understand why is it that despite the biases that no doubt exist, some countries really managed to take advantage and others didn't do at all. And that was definitely what I want to talk about in the book, and I will try to do this. And as I emphasize, a bias in the system, but there are huge differences between countries. Now, you could say, of course, well, it's just a form of historical predestination, as some people got a Nobel Prize for. I mean, it's more sophisticated what they got a Nobel Prize for, but, you know, it's not that common that you get a Nobel Prize largely for a popular book. But, you know, there's something interesting. But they make a big point of it, and when I want to push it a bit, then I would say, okay, it's institutions. How do institutions get delivered? They're delivered through history, you know, and I'm standing here in front of you as someone born in one of the Low Countries, working for the UK government. How can I come here now, talk to you and say, you know, if you want to change something, you better get a better history. Okay, so this is a bit hard, okay? So if that's the only thing, well, then we're doomed. If it's all historical institutional predestination, we're kind of doomed. Now, I'm not saying this is that they necessarily, the authors themselves subscribe to that, but sometimes it gets a bit interpreted and blame history and blame the institutions that it needs to be. Okay? Now, it's not that easy to use it as an explanation today why some countries in the last 30 years took advantage of global conditions and others didn't. Because there were countries like, contrast, say, Ghana and Nigeria, British colonial history, and Ghana took advantage, and Nigeria, well, it definitely didn't. Okay, and it got stuck somewhere. You got some countries that, you know, that basically in South Asia, you get, on the one hand, India and Pakistan. One clearly has belatedly, after 1990s, took advantage, and on another one clearly is stagnant in Pakistan, and with similar thing. Of course, there's more subtlety, and you will say, yeah, but you have to understand this and this and this about that particular country. But so you go beyond simply broad historical strokes, but a lot of specificity in the country. Okay? Now, another thing that you have to then recognize is that reasonably successful countries like the Indonesia of the world, or Bangladesh in recent times, and of course it's in a transition, or Ghana, Ethiopia, they definitely don't follow the textbook version of why nations fail. I mean, look, they are pretty bad in a whole series of things. In fact, we talk a lot about corruption in South Africa now. Vietnam, one of these massive successes, is ranked exactly at the same level in the Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International as South Africa. And in fact, Thailand and Indonesia, that clearly did better in this period, they're worse. So you have to be a bit careful to actually simply say, oh, it's the institutions, it must be, and these are the indicators that were used in some of the famous cross-country growth regressions that build up the story around why nations fail. So we have to be a bit careful about the specificity. It may be that in the long run, in 100 years, we will look back and say, yeah, that trend is there, but it doesn't explain prolonged periods of quite a lot of change, including in massive reductions in poverty. And for me, the point is that it becomes unsatisfactory to just settle on that. There's clearly something to do with the here and now choices of those people who have choice, the actions and behaviors of those people who can act and behave in a particular setting that will matter. Okay? And that's, I think, for me, the key thing. So the correlates of success, and I want to add to that, it's not as simple. Amongst quite a few of these successful places, where, you can try what you want, but China in its progress, in its period of progress, it was still a state-led economy. It maybe did certain things, but similarly, did we therefore say we must have state-led development to be successful? India started growing fast when it actually reduced the role of the state. And then you go to places like Bangladesh and Indonesia, they definitely didn't do that. They actually had systematically chosen for more market-based models, and that actually didn't change that much in itself. So it's not so much the ideological choice of states versus markets. And, unfortunate for me as a Democrat, on average, if you look at 10-year growth spells since the 19th century, across the world, on average, autocracies and democracies do equally well. On average, autocracies and democracies do equally well. I mean, thank God, as someone who likes democracy, the variance of autocracies is much wider. So some of the worst places on earth are autocracies, some of the fastest growing places are autocracies as well. And that makes democracy a little bit attractive because at least you can pick whoever gets to rule it. An autocrat, we can't pick before. And so those who wish for strong rule, you don't know what you get. You may get, dare I say, Tinubu, or you may get something like that, or indeed Mobutu Sese Seko, or you could get others. You could get Deng Xiaoping and actually make something happen. Similarly, and I emphasize, and I want to come back to that, clearly governance will matter. I'm definitely not going to say corruption is a good thing. But it is still striking that quite a lot of progress happened in countries that didn't change that much in anything to do with the things that we typically identify with good governance, with corruption or property rights or things like that. Very imperfect countries made progress. Now, for me, that's actually quite a hopeful message, because it does mean that countries that are pretty imperfect, that actually maybe for certain historical ideological reasons are more state-led or more market-led, that actually have not a perfect politics, they seem to be able to progress. And in fact, the more I look at it, I always enjoyed reading a very simple report that Michael Spence, Nobel Prize winner, coordinated about 15 years ago from the Growth Commission, where the one line that is always worth remembering, the rest is all fairly straightforward, about growth, which was a line that came from Robert Solow, and Solow had, in answer to, tell me about what should Bangladesh know to grow faster, I said, look, I don't know the recipe, I only know the ingredients for growth. And I think that seems to be it. The ingredients are properly something to do, make sure there's investment happening, make sure there's some infrastructure getting developed, make sure there's macroeconomic stability, make sure there's probably something that actually doesn't restrict your market to your domestic things, i.e. you're export-oriented to some extent, you value scarcity to some extent, and you get that list that is fairly broad. And that's probably when you then start looking. In fact, in that report I looked at 30 case studies of countries that grow fast, and that was as good as it got in terms of comparing them all. Fairly broad set of sensible things. Now, the question that I then ask myself is then, if actually getting a bit better growth, maybe not Singapore, maybe not China, but a bit better growth, doesn't really need rocket science, but actually needs some sensible economic policies, or reasonable ones. So why is it that so many countries don't manage to get to that? Why don't they manage to get to that? Now you can get extremes. So I can't help it, but Nigeria always springs to mind. You know, when we think macroeconomic stability is reasonable, then I never understand why Buhari allowed his central bank governor to have, what was it, 6 or 8 exchange rates, largely designed clearly for some people linked to the banking system to get rich. Now that doesn't sound to me like sound macroeconomic policies. So if you get that. So there's a set of choice, so the question becomes then a bit like, why don't more countries pursue more reasonable policies? Okay? And put it slightly differently, in most countries in the world, if I now take Malawi, I don't know how to get to Singapore, but I know to get a little bit better than what they have. I know in the DRC, it's quite straightforward how you can do a little bit better. So why is it not happening? And for me, that was definitely brought home. Once, about 10 years ago, I was invited to the Prime Minister's office of the DRC. And Matata Ponyo was the Prime Minister then. And he said, come and listen to us. Of course, I was working for the donor, and this clearly was an intention. Come and listen to our great development plans. With certain, and I was very interested. And so that's on the left. And a few months later, we were invited to Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a particular country. There's no photographs existent of the Prime Minister's office anywhere to be found on the web. So only this drawing that will always be done. It's a very different place. In DRC, they don't worry that a photograph is taken of it. And otherwise, you have Ethiopia. But the same question was that they wanted to, in both cases, to come and listen to their development plans. Come and actually tell us, come and listen and give us some feedback. So I go to the DRC, and we come into a room, 30 young men, it was all men, and I don't think gender was the issue necessarily, but still striking, 30 young men, each of them responsible for a sector, telling them the plans that we're going to do. About the macro, about moving away from the dollarization, about agro-industrial parks, about agricultural policies, education, health. And I listened the whole morning. I was actually pretty good. And I thought to myself, this actually, this is reasonable based on the evidence, a really good set of plans. That was very impressive. And I remember walking out, and I was together with a Congolese colleague who was a political scientist, and we were just past the gate there, and he started laughing, and he said, "Quel spectacle, what a show have I just seen?" And I thought for a second, I said, yes, of course. And we laughed away and said, yes, and we said, let's take a bet, nothing will ever be implemented of this. And indeed, nothing is ever implemented of these beautiful plans. Well, maybe one thing. The guy is now actually on trial for embezzling $420 million, the Prime Minister, from the time, about agro-industrial plants, one of the ones, and he basically seemed to have sent it all somewhere to the Cayman Islands. So yeah, okay, it's that. Now we go to Ethiopia, and that was actually really interesting. They asked us, can you get us a diverse set of experts? They value their ownership of their economic policies a lot, and can you get a diverse set? So we managed to get, with the support of the UK Embassy, we got Justin Lin from China, former chief economist of the World Bank, but arguably very close to the Communist Party. We had Lan Pritchett from Harvard, let's say quite different for anyone who knows Land. And we had Paul Collier, again very different, from Oxford. And we have three there, and we had a few more of them, where we sat with 5 or 6 of us listening for 2 days to a retreat by the senior people from the government. The Deputy Prime Minister was there, Minister of Finance, some of the technocrats advised to the Prime Minister, maybe 15 people. And they told us what they were going to do, and they asked us our ideas, and we talked. But they told us all kinds of things. And the very striking thing of what they told us, I remember very well thinking, this is not quite orthodox policy making. And any of you would like it to be heterodox. It wasn't heterodox either. It was just unorthodox macroeconomic policies. And it was interesting. So you listen to it, you get the feedback. But funny enough, despite having advisors there that we were brought in, afterwards we talked to each other and we all agreed, you know what, it's going to be tricky, not sure whether the balances can be kept, and maybe exposed we were right. It was very hard to keep the macroeconomy stable in this situation. But we all agreed they're going to try to do it, and may well be very successful. In fact, Ethiopia was the fastest growing economy in Africa in that decade. They did an infrastructure-led growth model, a very tricky one, but they got quite far, and Ethiopia definitely changed also in this period. So you get the different things. It's not a perfection of the plans, clearly, but it was something else. And for me, the one that I want to emphasize, and then bring it back to also thinking a bit about South Africa, is that I do think you need to understand the here and now. You know, if it's about actions of behavior and behaviors, you have to ask yourself, who can act and behave in particular ways at any moment in time? And so basically, I want to think about who is the elite at a particular moment that is controlling the state. So this is Douglas North, wrote, father of institutional economics as well, and he wrote this last book together with Weingast and Wallace, Violence and Social Orders. And this is the first paragraph of the book, and actually it's almost encapsulates all the rest of the book. And he said the way you should look at the state is to, in the old Max Weber style, as a solution to a problem of violence. But what is it? It's about a dominant coalition of elite groups that somehow make a deal that they will choose non-violence over violence in return for access to activities and access to the state. Okay? We're going to, and a dominant coalition, it doesn't mean a majority coalition, a dominant coalition. And that's how you should think of the historical state. And indeed, they seem to suggest you could look at all states all the time a bit like that. What is the coalition there? And that's the framework I used in my book, where you think about who are the people that can act and influence matters. Well, these are people with power and influence in the society. And it's not just typically the only one that typically 8 agencies end up talking to, the Minister of Finance and the President. No. It's the people with power. It's politicians, the political class, not necessarily all of them are ministers or whatever, but it's also the people in the military, the senior civil servants, obviously the business elite, and then actually the narrative tellers, the journalists, the academics, they can be very much part of it. These are people with power and influence, some with more power than others, and then you want to look at it. Amongst these, what is the dominant coalition at any moment in time? And basically, you should think of it as a deal at a particular moment, a coalition of these forces that manages to control a state, but somehow with the idea that can keep it more or less stable. Okay? Now, the important thing as me as an economist is say, look, I want to understand the way an economy is run and why certain actions are taken also with that political lens. And actually because, just as the Douglas North definition suggests, it always is not just a political deal. It's not like some researchers talk about political settlements, but it's misleading because it sounds as if it's just political. It's about economic, it's controlling resources, controlling activities, controlling trade, controlling the resources of the state, and so on. And so you could get quite a few of them, and I could go, indeed. I could read again, I never was there in that period, a kleptocracy like Mobutu Sese Seko in DRC, at the time Zaire. I mean, he was the best one. It's probably almost the purest kleptocracies we've ever seen. In fact, they were not shy about it. They would speak, and Mobutu had always the best lines. In fact, if you read French and you read the things he said, it's actually hilarious, however sad it is as well. It's amazing. So one thing, for example, he gave a speech in front of civil servants after the newspapers, because they were really in control. They couldn't care less what the newspapers said, but the newspapers were allowed to write and say, all the civil servants are corrupt. And he's in front of the TV, he got the civil servants together and he addressed them and said, I know you have to steal. But could you please, the next time you steal a little bit and leave something for the next one? That was his speech in response to these things. Now that's the kleptocracy. That's basically, you take control of the state as a dominant coalition and you use it simply to steal. I think it's quite rare, okay? I think we use the term loosely, but it's so rare. Most of the time, it's something much more complicated with various forces, say, think of the Russian elite bargain between wealth, politics, security apparatus, and the whole thing. It's distributed over more places, and it's not simply all around stealing. It's also about longer-term power and so on. It could also be a coalition of power embedded with military might. The important ones where military coups take over and maybe it can try to keep. That could be an elite bargain of the moment, could be a small minority, but could be done. I think a very common one is actually typically more like in a patronage-based elite bargain, but especially one with clientelist tendencies. What does it mean? Clientelist tendencies, clientelism is essentially a system where you tend to reward with jobs and contracts those who keep you in power. Actually, democracies have a tendency for that you reward your constituents, you have marginal seats that you favor. You know, in the UK, we were obsessed with what we called the Red Wall. It was like 10, 15 constituencies, and all the economic policies of Boris Johnson were focused on that. You know, because, you know, it's a form of clientelism. We need to get them to keep the power. So, and I want to emphasize this. This is not about, as some people sometimes got, and I must say even the book by North and Weingast and Wallace kind of says, oh, there's 34 countries called the OECD that sorted everything out, and the rest is there. No, he wrote it well before we saw Trump in action, we saw Boris Johnson in action, and all these kind of people, and there's plenty of other names we could mention. You know, we all look a bit like that, okay? And having worked in the front office with the Foreign Secretary in the UK, I can assure you that George Orwell was right, that some are more equal than others, especially who has the WhatsApp number of the relevant minister, okay? That's the way it works, okay? And so you just understand it. You know, this may be maybe a little bit of the old Marxist in me as when I was a teenager, that I think ideas and ideology, religion is somewhere, comes above it as the interwoven. It's not just driving in itself. But of course, the narratives matter, and the narratives get told and they get justification. But I want to emphasize and come back also on the South African case later on. Any deals on transition tend to have these features as well. There need to be an elite bargain. There need to be a deal, some form of elite bargain, a new dominant coalition, because states don't quite exist if they implode into violence. And in a way, countries that are in civil war, you could say, well, elites have failed to strike the right elite bargain. If I look at South Sudan, or indeed Sudan today, it's nothing more complicated than elite groups that somehow don't want to do the deal with the other to actually get peace and stability, even if they could massive rents from it. They're fighting over rents, they're fighting over control, and they judge that violence may give them in the longer run more rents than actually striking the deal. If you think of the Yemen conflict, it's exactly like that. But anyway, so why are some countries making more progress than others? So what is it that these, relatively speaking, winners then have? And so in the book I want to argue is that sometimes people manage to get dominant coalitions around here from the elite that actually is totally consistent with growth and development, or sufficiently consistent with it. Okay, and that's actually successful nations. If you start looking at the case studies, and I will say descriptively, you know, people will say, can I prove it, can I predict it? It's pretty hard. But when you look at, say, Indonesia under Suharto, or when you look at in Bangladesh after around 1995, return to democracy. If you look at Ghana, similar times, the return to democracy, somehow or another, these elite bargains became consistent with growth and development. If you think of China in 79, somehow it's the same party in power, but it's different factions in the party that seem to gain power, and it becomes a deal that has actually growth and development much more central. So why would they do this? So you could talk about and say, you know, campaigning on all national commitment and post-independence. Most nations, you know, that was the slogans in 1830 when Belgium became independence, where I'm from. You know, it's a slogan in other times when independence, national commitment. But I think behind it, it's more about probably issues to do with legitimacy or maybe later on legacy. Okay? And basically, elites need legitimacy. Otherwise, they will be undermined. The pressures will be so much, one way or another. And if you look at the history of England, most of the changes in terms of more redistribution and more franchise in the political space was because elites somehow felt the pressure and had to give in. In fact, there's a paper, and I always forget the authors, but the title is Democracy by Mistake, which is basically a description of how in England democracy emerged. Elite groups that gave in because they think we can contain it by giving a bit more of the franchise and opening up a little bit and letting the commercial class get a bit of the rights, and the landed class thought they could manage it, and then the bourgeoisie thought they could handle it and they had to give the workers a bit more rights, and so on. This is not like in a beautiful linear thing. This is also about containing power. I fear that some of you will know where I will go later. A source of maximizing rents, they say, well, why don't you all pick it? Because growth creates more rents, so why don't we take it? Now, I think that's probably where there's one insight that I definitely learned working on this that I haven't seen before, is actually people tend to forget that actually choosing for growth and development in any society is a bit of a gamble. Because it allows new aspirations to emerge. It allows new groups to become wealthy, because growth typically will have new parts, new industries emerge, and so on. And they will want a piece of the cake, including of control of the state. And in fact, I think it's because basically growth and development is a gamble, that simply saying we're going to maximize the rents is not really the most convincing explanation for me. Because, yeah, you may want to try to do it, but you have to have a lot of confidence. And in fact, we see, as I gave the earlier example of democracy by mistake, that actually elite groups gamble on giving a bit more, and actually in the end, like the landed class in England, lost at least something. By the way, they never lost it totally. You know, in Scotland, we still have 500 families controlling 50% of the land in Scotland. You know, that's part of the elite deal now in the UK. It's still there, you know, that's not, maybe they gambled well, the Scottish nobles, because they're still very powerful in that sense. But the status quo is very attractive. The status quo, if you're a bit risk averse and elite, why would you want change? You know how to play the status quo because you're part of the dominant coalition. You probably know how to play it. You know, think of Nigeria, so much resources wasted. But you know, why would we give up this game all around oil and the recycling and the distribution of the wealth? You know, yeah, you know, we run the risk that we don't have that anymore. I mean, think of the rents in Nigeria. You know, oil is roughly, if we per capita distributed the oil rents, we would get about $400 per person. Well, that's nothing. But if I not give it amongst 200 million people, but 100,000 people, you'll see the calculation. That's multiple zeros, 5 extra zeros coming to it. Now, that's suddenly interesting. And that's the elite bargain basically in Nigeria, 100,000. It's quite broad. Why would they give that up? Why would you change the political system? Why would you do anything? Why would you give that up? Anyway, I think actually when you start looking at the cases, this narrative is consistent. So I'm not going to say I can prove, say in a particular way that this is really clear true, but it helps you to think a bit about places like China, where basically the Communist Party in 1979, you know, was really under threat. Mao had died in 1976, the Gang of Four was positioning, and they wanted power and they wanted to embark on a new cultural revolution, which was the one that had basically allowed 800 million people to remain extreme poor. Actually, the reformers said, look, how can we ever get legitimacy as a communist party? You know, there's no paradise in heaven. You have to have it on earth. A communist party at some point says, well, we better start delivering something. And in fact, if you look at the writings of Deng Xiaoping, it's about legitimacy. We need to get legitimacy by first getting food security sorted, and then growth so we can do it. And then in 1989, when the pressure from below comes, Tiananmen Square, you get the writings that were smuggled out of the Central Committee that Deng Xiaoping said, you know what, we better send the tanks in because our legitimacy as a party would be undermined, and we better keep on going and building the legitimacy through growth and development. And that's basically what we would get. Now you get it in other ways. In India, it was actually took a long time. In 1980s, a lot of thinking about how can we actually move forward in growth. People talked about the Hindu growth rate, something cultural, it's in the culture, they will be stagnant. And then Manmohan Singh and others in 1991 managed to actually get the right moment, an IMF program, a crisis provides the moment, they manage to actually get some of the change. And we can go further in different countries. There's actually these moments where actually, typically with legitimacy and a window of opportunity, often linked to a crisis, that progress is possible. So what's the difference here? Well, in Ethiopia, we had a government that represents a minority in 1992 coming to power. Okay, brought it to coalition somewhat, but it was essentially quite a minority of an elite from the different ethnic groups. With one leading ethnic group from Tigray, their legitimacy was minimal. They consolidated their power in the 1990s, but then were faced in 2002 with a drought of the scale of the 1984 drought. Okay, and people know the 1984 drought was the big famine drought and the whole stories around it. They managed to work with the international community to stabilize it, but somehow that undermined the legitimacy that they were so dependent on others, and also the legitimacy of the government in power wasn't necessarily there. So they thought in 2005, let's do elections. Now that didn't go well either. And before the election results were properly announced, they had made a mistake to posting preliminary results, which I remember scraping from the web, that looked very different from the final ones. They had no legitimacy to the ballot box either. And you got very much then a Prime Minister, Meles Zenawi, that fundamentally committed to saying, well, this is an issue of national security, i.e. read us staying in power. And actually it's a country with a national security strategy that's designed around development. Almost copycat, in other words, from Deng Xiaoping in China. And it had at the moment. But it created commitment. It created a quest for legitimacy. And you have maybe not an inclusive government in some senses, but it worked very hard at getting growth and development. And yes, we can talk about why it all went undone or went wrong in later periods. But the essence is they never managed to get a political deal that evolved, broad enough, and they banked entirely on the economic deal, on the economic progress. And the political deal wasn't there. DRC, I couldn't care less. They have natural resources, Kabila at the time was forced by the IMF to release all the contracts for natural resources. I think it was 26 that the IMF expected before they would give further credit. They released 25, and the IMF said, okay. There was one not given that was turned out later on to be the one owned by the family Kabila. That was never seen, and they controlled the whole thing. Another thing, though, that's important here, and I want to finish it before I now go to quickly move on to South Africa. We should not be mistaken to think that they all did it with the state. I already said they did it not that state-led development. It's very striking if you look at what Indonesia or Bangladesh did relative to Korea and China. China and Korea were the developmental state, and I'm getting very tight whenever I travel around African countries. We need to have a development state in Malawi. No, you can't have a developmental state in Malawi. Why is that? Because Korea and China have probably about 2,000 years of centralized government, more than 1,000 years of centralized meritocratic state exams, and more than 1,000 years of centralized taxation. Now you can read whatever you want about institutional economics. These tend to be the characteristics. The Malawian state is built up post-independence largely on clientelist basis. These are jobs in reward as a reward for support of those in power. Don't expect them to do it. Actually, that was what happened in Indonesia and in Bangladesh. And they were smart. They basically understood, if we want to progress, we don't do it via state-led development. And we actually picked much more market-led. And I call this actually a certain self-awareness of the state, a certain pragmatism. If you have a clientelist state, don't expect the state to do too much. If you have a meritocratic historical state, maybe you can get very far. And even places like Singapore, when they made the state far more meritocratic, there are even historical roots to it. So what do we say about South Africa? I'm now going to get in trouble, okay? So, apologies. I'll put it forward and then you shoot me down, okay? The state of the economy. Of course, the facts, you'll have to accept them. Probably the most unequal country in the world with a Gini coefficient roughly of what I have there. Low growth. Again, of course, pre-apartheid was only a third of this. So actually, you know, you did something, but not that much. And then you actually have 4 high-income countries amongst the highest poverty rates. And of course, it comes with inequality, but according to these extreme poverty measurements, it's about 15%. You know, Thailand with a similar GDP has 1%. Indonesia has 4% with a lower GDP on the upper middle income status. So there is something there. I don't have to explain that the macro doesn't look that good. Energy, logistics. We also know that, you know, you may look like Vietnam, but Vietnam has looked for a long time like that with the corruption index, and actually South Africa went down, so the change may be important. And then with massive structural imbalances in wealth and ownership of anything, and of course with spatial exclusion as well. You know that stuff. Now, underlying it, and then my question is really, well, what does the deal, and what does the deal look like? I'm going to be very stylist, I'm going to make mistakes, and you're going to not like what I say. Well, maybe, but definitely I'm not going to do. But it's helpful over the period. And of course, during apartheid, yeah, this was an incredibly restricted elite bargain. A coalition of forces clearly to keep power around race and capital, with very clientelist to a small group of people, but then basically a monopoly of violence, okay? I don't think that's, maybe use other words, but it's there. What's uninteresting is that every change needs a deal for stability. The deal for stability here, I think, was an elite bargain, and I put it bluntly now, between black trade unions and white capital. And somehow or another, think of it, the basis of the labor that was involved in the formal sector, and then white capital. And it's a deal for stability. Now, you know, we all admire as outsiders the transition that happened here, because it could have gone very, very badly wrong. And it was a deal for stability, and it needs to be admired. And maybe, at the time, it was the best outcome. Now, since then, you could have 2 narratives, and maybe one dominating for a while and then came back. So, you know, definitely towards the Zuma period, a move much more converging to what other African countries also experienced, the patronage clientelist state, probably most visible during the Zuma period. The other part would say that the elite bargains slowly widened with much more, you know, an emergence of black middle class through an absorption in that elite bargain, including in that formal economy. I would actually say it never really managed to get a development bargain, because that would see itself over time in faster growth and faster change. Now, I'm not saying that you could have done more initially. I'm not entirely sure. See, I'm going to get in trouble. I can feel it. And of course, striking features and symptoms, and I think caused by the lack of such a deal, you know, perpetuation of spatial inequalities in the country, a persistence of high inequality. Having said that, I don't know whether I got the numbers right, and there's definitely people in the room who know this far better, but pre-transfers versus post-transfer, it's quite a big change in the Gini coefficient as well, if you calculate it. So it doesn't mean that there is no redistribution, but the redistribution gets you 2.63 as a Gini coefficient, which is still very high. And then, of course, some of these things, like including work that Murray and so on did, where, you know, you get actually a group, you know, a change in the inequality also amongst the black community, that moving into some of these more middle classes groups. So I hope I didn't offend anyone with language use there. But of course, an expectation aspiration gap that is far faster than actually what gets delivered. So more clientelism, as we observe in state effectiveness and so on. But arguably it's because the initial deal was limited. It couldn't get much further. Now, of course, it begins sometimes, and maybe it's better now than when I was first thinking about it, the cycle then makes it difficult. Crime rates are higher, homicide rates are higher than Mexico, then, you get somehow an issue. Yeah? So, what can be done? Now, I want to be constructive now and actually think a bit about. So what would you need to have an elite bargain for development and growth? And again, you're not going to turn into Singapore overnight. You're not going to get Vietnam-style changes. But somehow, the deal for peace and stability amongst elite groups has to be consistent with growth and development. Okay? And I'll come back what I mean with that in a moment. You need to understand the state you have and not the state you've dreamed that or want to imagine that you have. And I want to emphasize that you don't think you have a state that should do everything, because the state is not anymore proving the ability to do that, even when the state effectiveness is going down. But you need processes of external accountability, for example, political processes. And you need process of internal accountability. There's none of these case studies that I looked at in other countries that actually didn't have something. Okay, what I mean in China, of course it didn't have external accountability through elections, but it had to compensate for an extremely brutal and rigid system of internal accountability. Vietnam, I don't quite want to be a corrupt billionaire today, given the verdict that you may have seen in the newspapers, that if a lady doesn't fight 9 billion, she will be executed very soon. Because the law says if you can pay back 75% of what you've stolen, or what has been stolen under your watch, your life will be spared. Now, it's a certain internal accountability, SBF in the US got off lightly, okay? Sam Friedman, whatever his name was, yes. So, what did we get? Well, definitely, I think in the worst moment in recent times, you got an elite bargain just about for stability, keeping it just about together. An elite bargain where the state was increasingly more clientelist, but also where the expectations that were raised what the state should be doing were massively raised. Where then, as a result, internal accountability became very limited, and external accountability was still very strong, but if internally there's no action on it, then it gets very hard. So of course, that becomes zero-sum. That's stagnation, if you get there. And I'm afraid we could have other countries that we can describe like this. Now, try to be more constructive. I think a lot of attention goes, this is the first thing that needs to change, internal accountability. And I hear a lot about this. Okay, if I put on my comparative hat, I want to remind you that Vietnam is similarly corrupt as South Africa, and that Thailand and Indonesia are worse. So, as seen from growth and development, is in itself, there's wastage as a result, but it's in itself maybe sometimes hoping too much. If we clean up the state, all will be well. It won't change that much structurally. And one of the things that structurally may change is when you get virtuous cycles of growth, because then the pressures and the ability to get change becomes then there. So counting too much on this may not be the best route. It's important and I value it, it's not there. This, of course, is not the answer. And I turn it in color it red because, there's parties to the left of the current political coalition that actually probably want to color it red, okay? But then be self-aware is that, and the friends here from Zim will probably say, I'm not sure that's the best route to take, okay? It's not the best route to take. But that actually means there's far less conversation around what would this need to entail. How do we get somehow new deal around, or whatever the deal is, a renewed deal for stability that is more consistent with growth and development? How do we get a more deeply shared commitment for growth and not for the status quo? Now, I don't see that enough, and I can talk to lots of you as individuals, even people in the presidency, in the treasury, but actually, it's not entirely clear. So what does it mean what to do? And I'm not ending necessarily with an optimistic note, I will tell you that, but I want to just suggest in that framework I use, and maybe then you can object to. Structural inequality, you know, even the IMF says that your levels of inequality are bad for growth, okay? There's plenty of research now from the IMF that maybe overstates a bit of cross-country growth regressions, but it still will say, look, the kind of inequality levels, which is basically you've overtaken Latin America, are basically really bad for growth. So basically, and here in this country, of course, it's in income, it's in wealth, and it's in space. It's in all the dimensions that I could think of. It's in education, as we have papers here, it's in all kinds of dimensions. The problem is really that, and remembering Zim as well, that even, you know, the chapter in the Handbook of Economic Growth by Banerjee and Duflo actually has a very nice statistic that nobody ever quotes that from Banerjee and Duflo, but I like to quote it, which is actually saying there's a very strong correlation between countries that had rapid changes of inequality and negative growth. Growth collapses. Now, this is a conundrum, okay? High inequality is bad for growth, but rapid change in inequality is also bad for growth. And so I think it comes back to that political economy story. Rapid change in inequality, it's very hard to keep the stability. And that's, of course, one of the challenges you have. Now, if I interpret what you're doing, you take it slowly. You basically have this view, which is similar that we observe in some Latin American countries. The way out is by stealth building up the human capital and the asset base of those who are excluded. There's no redistribution, but it's more by stealth. We're building up the assets to actually bring it closer, mainly human capital. It works, by the way, okay? But that's how you do it. You do some redistributive transfers, and more than maybe people give credit to the country, but still you start from an extreme inequality. And you do something, maybe active labor market policies. I don't know whether that's the right term to use as positive discrimination, but in analysis terms, there is active labor market policies that favor particular groups. Now it's really interesting because all of this is to actually saying, can I close the gap somehow? But in a country that's not growing, it's about replacement and it's about pushing, unless you really believe that supply creates demand. But most of the time I don't tend to believe this. i.e., job supply doesn't tend to create job demand, labor demand. Okay? Most of the time, demand tends to create supply, but supply doesn't tend to create demand as easily. Okay? And I think that root of working on structural inequality, it's virtuous and it's good, but it's very slow change in the status quo. It will be very slow change in the status quo. And my question is this enough? Is there a need for actually getting more consensus on doing something more? I don't know. But otherwise it will be a very slow path on the inequality. Of course, I was lucky enough talking with a few people from the presidency the other day, and they say, well, we're quite aware of this, so we need to go back to growth. Okay? Now, IMF tells you the high inequality is a hindrance, so you need to overcome the hindrance and then see whether you can do enough. So even the most optimistic forecast for lots of the policies that government wants to do is maybe we can lift it from 1% to 3% growth. You know, in Asia they smile, okay? If you manage to get your growth to 3, because that's per capita, you know, barely getting at 2, okay? And so it's low. But the strategy in South Africa is now, and as I said, you know, it's good, and it's good for your fiscal balances, but it's how far does it get? Now that's an interesting one, because of course a lot of attention has gone in electricity and logistics, and definitely on electricity a lot of progress is being made, or there's some progress being made, a lot of work to be done. And bring in private sector. So the strategy clearly is here, can we boost growth to more efficiency, such as state-owned enterprises, getting logistics to function better, electricity and so on. But the interesting thing, it's about getting the formal sector to be more efficient and get a bit of growth in the hope that that can begin to absorb that whole informal side. Okay? Now, I can only suggest that's slow. Does it ever create the dynamism on the informal sector? Well, it feels like politically it's very important to have this view. We get the informal up to the formal And we'll never have in any case, I'm not trying to argue for that, but that's clearly what you see much more in other countries, where there's a bit of allow the informal to be semi-formal and not worry too much about it. Okay? Regulatory stuff, labor market stuff, and so on. I'm not saying it is. But again, it's again a slow change in the status quo. The pressure will be slow. Now, it leads me to say the elite bargain is still not that different from what it was in 1994. It is actually one for the status quo largely, and not for change. Now, as I said, it's always helpful to have Zim nearby. Quick reversals can be very disruptive. I don't think that will make the difference. But I think it matters. So what did other countries do? Now, it's interesting that other countries trying to sit in these kind of situations, well, you could look at it, but actually they formed all kinds of coalitions, you know? I mean, even Korea, you know, it comes in the news today, but if you think of it, the nature of their change was coalition building between business and military and the political forces, and it's still going on clearly, as we hear in the news today, all this maneuvering, but it's finding somehow the consensus. The Chinese Communist Party needing to convince the military wings, the conservative wings and whatever, to actually do this. It's about making that strong enough. Because if just one group claims for it, oh well, it will be killed off because the coalition is not formed. And so actually, arguably, and maybe, what happened in the politics in the last year, maybe there is some space here and some scope for that. It will need actions and behaviors, because there needs to be trust that actually the change is beginning to happen. And then I don't have to tell you, and I'm sure you can give me a long list of them, there will be spoilers on all sides of the divide. Spoilers that will threaten to take the capital out, spoilers that will threaten to put the labor on the street. And because the status quo works for most of these players, including from the left and the right. It tends to work. The status quo, and that's actually the striking thing, it tends to work for those who get the benefits from it. And it keeps other people out. How to do this? Well, it's not just about a strong leader. I emphasized the autocracy, but it needs much stronger coalition building, and I can't see it otherwise here. So I'm going to stop here. I hope I provoked you enough, and happy to take any questions. Thank you. How do we do this? Thank you. Shall I go and sit down? I stay? What is happening? I stand here, okay. Stay here.
I'm just the master of ceremony. Before this meeting, ERSA had the idea to ask people to put questions online. Maybe with low expectation, we had at least 300 questions. Therefore, I'll go one by one and see if
But you will pass them on. But you will pass
I will definitely pass it on. I think it was very interesting for two things. One is, obviously, these are the questions that are very much in mind of a lot of South Africa. There is high school kids, there is people from all over, actually, the continent, etc. And the second one is obviously the interest of your work. I can assure you it's not normal. Therefore, there was some attraction, certainly some attraction of your thing. I use this one just to start with a couple of questions that sort of summarize what, I try to summarize in 3 points what all these people do. The first one is what is to be done. In the sense that a lot of people talk about what is the development strategy. But you are, for what I understand, you are really pushing away. It's not an issue of policy. Therefore, a lot of the questions are in that element. And the other question then is, in some sense, the elite are endogenous as well.
Yep.
Therefore, what are the possible pressure? A lot of the questions are around GNU. Therefore, is the GNU, the loss of power of the ANC, therefore the need of the ANC to survive, could this be a sort of development strategy in some sense, because you need to grow just to keep the power. And a lot of the question is about the external environment. The external environment has become much more difficult, even for the best elite, if we are lucky to have the best elite. And actually, I think South Africa has a very good elite compared to. What is the effect of the external environment, and how we should, and a lot of the question really how, in relation to the breaking down of the international system, etc., there are a lot of questions around the BRICS, the possibility to find a new partner of the elite. Therefore, I start with these three reflections, and then after we open to, I hope to the 300 people that put questions, I summarize enough.
Well, it's, I have the microphone, yeah. I mean, look, the first thing, it's definitely the case, the more, as an economist, as a researcher, we of course are interested in the kind of first best answer, the best outcome, the best thing that could be done. I think what I've learned interacting with politics is that, you better understand that a lot of it will be second best, where the constraint is basically the political environment. Now, the interesting thing is to link it to the point that you make about the elite. Of course, the elite there, the constraint is endogenous as well. And so good policy making tries to find these windows of opportunity where you can push the needle a bit, but actually that then probably weakens the opposition to change. Success can breed success, or actually can weaken the spoilers, the ones that can do it, And to give an example, to the contrary, okay, so I work a lot internationally. South Africa would be always much more careful with the national community, given its GDP per capita and its own human capital. But if I go to other African countries, I'm always concerned, you occasionally get a reformist finance minister in a country. And then all the IMF, the World Bank move into it and push them, open up everything, do it up. And then within 6 months they're sacked. Yeah, and then basically you burn them because you are just in a hurry. And I say, no. Actually what you want to do is strengthen these people's their hands. You want to give them successes. You want them to be able to be there for a long time. You want historically the Trevor Manuels to be there for a long time and to do their job and have that. And so there's a bit like there as well in terms of maybe the first point to say. There's more to be said on the point, and I know you had it elsewhere. But then it's about the international environment, okay? Now, I didn't rub it in, and maybe I should have done it. Of course, South Africa, post-apartheid, did not take advantage of very benign global conditions. Its export performance went down, and it chose a particular route, and it became a bit mixed with ideology and ideas and so on. And maybe that obsession with that formal sector that needed to be heavily protected at all costs, and not trying to get an economy that was more integrated. I was somehow thinking of car industry and things like that. So somehow or another that choice was made. So that window of opportunity was not taken. Now you have to be a huge optimist to actually, relative to the global demand, the collective global demand that existed in OECD countries when, politicians like Margaret Thatcher happily destroyed their own manufacturing industry, so that you could sell to them, which China filled in, that Asia is going that route where the demand will be created now. So you could have friends in Russia and in China, but definitely the Chinese will make it themselves. And that idea to go and then take advantage of the international community. So I don't see that as a big opportunity, because they are turning their economy more inward looking. And I think other Asian countries have gone to a model that becomes very hard for you to take advantage of. Having said that, if you don't sell more to the world, then that growth will not be sustainable. So it may well be with services-led growth and whatever, much harder to do and all this kind of stuff. But the external environment, if you want to say the BRICS will provide us with the opportunity, most of the BRICS have their own problems, and not that they really get on that well. You know, India and China are in the same group there. It's going to be really hard. So we're not quite there. Maybe in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years there, but it's much harder. And so that's a bit of where the opportunities are harder. We could talk much more about what that would mean, but there is definitely internally in this economy, I mean, think of the spatial disconnect that links between the formal and the informal disconnect. Surely from a simple, theory model of resource allocation and misallocation, there must be massive gains to be had. So growth from efficiency gains obviously should still be getting there, but it will involve difficult choices in regulatory environments and so on, to get that misallocation of capital and labor to be better matched. And then finally, will there be an opportunity? No, I definitely think so. I don't fully understand your politics, of course. I try to follow it and observing, but just the mere fact that the nature of the coalition resembles more closely to probably the one that did the deal originally, is probably a positive thing. That actually, and you can hear it from my tone, I don't encourage you to go Zim route and the dramatic change, but nor will I want to liberalize left, right, and center. So you do it from politics from the center has its opportunity, because that's where coalitions can be forged. And so maybe this is the basis, but of course, they can only sustain themselves if they begin to deliver, including on the economy, and then, then I leave it up to them to find these entry points. Maybe as a starting point.
I have to say, as a Belgian and Italian, this policy is very easy to understand. Let me open to the 300 here. Yes.
Thank you, Stefan. I thought that was very interesting. One of the things that makes me think about is that there's this kind of emerging political science and sociology literature in South Africa on like the political economy of corruption, which starts from this position that the kind of defining feature, not amazingly innovative thought, but the defining feature is that the political elite is very distinct from the economic elite. So political elite, just to be completely frank, obviously is predominantly black, the economic elite predominantly white. It's not completely, separate. Like there are people like Ramaphosa, Patrice Motsepe, who are political elites but very invested in the kind of, I think, productive investment growth kind of paradigm you're talking about by the nature of their economic interests. But the key point that this literature kind of makes is that you have this large part of the political elite which is completely structurally excluded from the economy, and they have no method of wealth accumulation except via the state, right? And so what do you do if that's the case? I mean, how do you get an elite bargain when you have these seemingly quite opposed situations? I mean, some of the people in that literature say the thing is to allow a bit more corruption, bring the corrupt elites along, right? But how do you allow a bit of corruption, but not a lot of corruption? How do you get, like people say, I think in Bangladesh, that corruption was important there, but it was reinvested. How do you get corruption which is reinvested rather than just consumed? Or if the other story is you open up the economy with kind of a radical reform, how do you stop the current kleptocratic elite from just taking that all? So I think your talk speaks to that, but how do you create a bargain under such circumstances?
Shall I take that straight away? Yeah, okay. So it's good I now remember it. Sorry, Teddy. So it's a great question, and that's definitely also reading around and before coming, that point gets clearly made. And of course, it's not unique to the country. That's, you referred correctly also to some of the Asian economies. Now, there's two parts of it here. Is that first of all, of course, one shifted to that equilibrium, okay, and that equilibrium is now a collective action equilibrium. It becomes very hard to actually disappear. Once you settle on that equilibrium, it's there. And yes, it is actually, that's a bargain. Actually, that's a form of an elite bargain that is in its nature is, it is now a dominant coalition that condones it because. and go back to the Douglas North definition, it fits entirely into it. It's about controlling the state and the resources. Now, how do you get out of it is a very interesting thing, because maybe there's a little bit what I say, and don't misquote me now, anyone who wants to quote me, is that I don't want to condone it. It's not good. There's nothing normative about it. But the Bangladesh point is made. I know better the Indonesia point, where during the Suharto times, corruption was a part of keeping the elite bargain together. It was actually a very interesting case. Suharto came into power in the early 1970s on the back of a military coup. He represented the military who had been responsible for killing 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 people in the countryside. And he kicked out the original independence hero, Sukarno, who was basically the old nationalist elite, who had taken control of, it was a small group, but had taken control of a lot of the assets. So Suharto needs legitimacy. How do I get legitimacy? He says, well, my only way of legitimacy was indeed through growth and job creation. But he had the only route he could properly think of, and he chose right, was inviting Japanese investment. Now, this is not so long after the Second World War, and Japan had done awful things in Indonesia. So, of course, the nationalist elite who had fought against the Japanese was furious. So the deal was essentially that they took control of Petromina. He gave the old elite control of the old state-owned enterprises, the petroleum holding company, and even if today there is a scandal about corruption in Indonesia, it's always linked to Petromina. It became part of the acceptance, even under current democratic rule, that actually, that it is there. Now, I'm not saying it's good, there's a cost to it. But Yuan Ang, who you may know, who's written about corruption, and makes it quite an interesting thing, because these things that are more predictable transactional corruption, you know how to handle it. And in fact, in the Suharto case, it was very clear. People here will understand, at least, her name was Tien Cent. Now, if you think of what it is in Dutch, 10 cent, so she was Madame 10%. And the idea was systematically, on all the big government contracts, the Suharto family would take 10%. It was consistent with growth because it's predictable, okay? And it's clear. If I go to the DRC, I have no idea how much I will end up paying if I export coffee. Because if I export coffee from Matadi port, then I have to have 45 signatories and 6 stamps. And the price for each of these is definitely not reported. And it becomes unpredictable. So there's never any official exports of coffee in that place. So there is an element about thinking through the nature of the corruption and so on. Now, how do you get out of it? You want to get out of it. Indonesia tries to act on it and slowly, but it's very hard of it. I want to probably say it's a high order problem, but it's not a first order problem for growth. And I'm not going to get in trouble now. But that's how I would be sympathetic to the point that literature also alludes to. By the way, in most countries in the world, the legal corruption, i.e. the manipulation, totally by legal means of procurement processes, is far larger than the illegal corruption. The Odebrecht in Brazil, the construction company, okay, in the end they managed to get to them, but their trick was to convince people that wrote corruption specifications to write them so that they were the best firm to bid on it. They won all the bids. So, just be careful. The legality and the illegality can also be very constraining. And so again, one wants to be careful making simply corruption bad and all the rest of regulatory stuff is good, because there will be rents captured by oligopolies, by monopolies as well, and you want to take that into account as well. Anyway, yeah.
Thanks, Stefan. Sometimes my anxiety also flares up because as an economist, we want, to take out patterns and really understand some variables. And we want to see, but elite bargain is a very different animal. It's very difficult to find sufficient number of observations in the world of elite bargains to really characterize in that. And well, what I want your thought, and you started talking about this when you started your talk, was how to think about elite bargain and how to sort of really characterize it. And that leads to my second question, where I was trying to, in my mind, to try and create patterns in some of these situations. And can you say something about the evolution of the incumbent, say, party that's governing because usually in the first period of their tenure, they battle, consolidating power and then moving on to certain, and then the legitimacy questions can come. And can you say that that kind of evolution, can we kind of see a pattern in that kind of evolution where those countries that were successful found themselves in the particular state of the evolution of their party? Yeah.
So look, it's a good question. I mean, it always is fairly complicated to think about multiple equilibrium and collective action equilibrium. We're not very good at predicting collective action equilibria either. And in the world of multiple equilibrium, multiple Nash equilibria, we're not very good at that either. And we get so used to saying there has to be that single equilibrium that we all tend to. And this is, and these are expectations equilibria, which you as a macroeconomist should be happy to understand. There could be expectation equilibria. So that's definitely the formalization of what you think. So, but to come to the other part of it is that, it's probably there's two things. How do, in a world of multi-equilibria, how do things get changed? It's usually by big shocks. And there are big shocks that are occurring, but think of it as windows opportunities where expectations can shift into something else. Now, the problem is with an incumbent group. So, for example, Bangladesh is an interesting case now. Okay, so, of course, there's a lot of revisionism going on, and now suddenly the entire reign of Hasina has been supposedly terrible. But actually, if you look at it, quite a lot was achieved. So there's a mixed bag. There was definitely a decline in economic governance and definitely more stealing by the people that were close to power. But at the same time, this is a dramatic increase, 25 years of 6% growth, but highly inclusive. Signs of structural transformation in a country that was written off in the 1970s. And so you get these changes. But the problem is often that, and other people have written about it, we of course have far more in history growth spurts of 15, 20 years than things that can sustain. And the way to understand it is that when new groups emerge, the ones in power want to stay in power. They don't want to open up. They don't want to give in to the pressure. They don't want to give to the aspirational groups or the ones who actually now produce the return to the economy and so on. The old one do, and that's a bit like what we get. So the incumbency, just as in any kind of political economy problem, can become a real problem there, is that incumbency does all it can to stay incumbent and will use all means possible to keep that new version of the status quo. So Bangladesh is also interesting. If you think of it, a big part of the big change in the economy was the rise of the garment industry from essentially nothing, from essentially Daewoo from Korea investing in 1977 or something, one factory that went bankrupt, but luckily the Koreans had decided to train 50 people into the garment production to be in some calculations the first, in other calculations the second largest garment exporter in the world. Okay? So there's some coincidence that happened, no big industrial policy, just coincidences that happened. But the people that became the big firms there, they were not politically important. And they actually had incentives to try to use the markets and so on. It's still a messy country, whatever, but they did it. But the interesting thing is, come in the last 10 years, they were the ones controlling Hasina's party. They had all become MPs, all the big families, they were now in parliament, and of course doing everything they could, that all the industrial policy and massive subsidies during COVID, 95% went to the garment industry, and no new industries could ever get any attention from the state. That's a form of incumbency, in this case the business elite, that will try to now shape it than doing it. So you get these processes that are very striking. Yeah. But Teddy will talk more. I should let other questions go.
Hello? Fun, hi.
Ah, hi.
Hilton from...
Hold it a bit higher, and then straight into...
Jeez, thank you. Hilton from UCT. Thanks, Stefan, for the very insightful lecture. So I agree 100% with your analysis. It's spot on, and I actually think that you get us, or at least me in my thinking, one little step closer to thinking about that critical juncture that Asimoglu and Robinson really brought to the fore, which was this sort of elusive thing to think about. But I feel like you really pinpointing that framework. I'm not a specialist in development economics or anything. I'm a macro. Do policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy. But I think maybe thinking about I can't really add much to what you said. So I thought about maybe what you missed. And often what comes into the discussion is about the sort of pact or regional agreement or the positive externalities that could arise from growth within Africa. So intra-Africa trade, development, whatever we want to call that. So do you see in your sort of knowledge and experience into this area for many decades now, sort of these regional spillovers, regional pacts or positive externalities, that's not just stuck at the national level? Yeah. I think that's something to speak about. And do you see potential for growth to be this self-virtuous cycle of growth to be sustainable within an Africa context, if there's a better pact and agreement and sort of this incentives can be aligned within Africa? I mean, we hear about the African Union and what they want to do, and I mean, that's all nonsense, but I'm wondering what you, with their currency, and there's a lot of stuff that's fluff, but I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Okay, let me quick. So this is a really good question, and it often comes up as well. And you know, I don't use the words pact and so on because that always sounds a bit like a signing ceremony and so on. And one of my lines is that the elite bargain will not be televised. So you know, it's so much more implicit. It's so much more behaviors that begin to more align with expectations. So multiple things. And then we come into the Africa thing. So there's one thing that always struck me, even when I was working as chief economist coming here, I was so struck how little South Africa looked at the rest of Africa. Okay? And its relative dominant, potential dominant position didn't really think through it. Now, the neighbors and so on maybe, but actually in terms of kind of a longer term strategic economic dimension, and the joint interest of a better functioning African economy, politically virtually never any investment that I saw. I never see any investment in that. In fact, if anything, it always comes very quickly protectionist. Reluctance to sign the African Free Trade, or whatever it's called again, the African Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, reluctance almost to do it. And I'm just thinking there, you know, this is the one economy that would benefit most from it. And it actually is reluctant, politically or economically, to actually act on it. You know, reluctant investors, little risk-taking. Yeah, you have a bit of ShopRite and some supermarkets, but that's not going to transform Africa either and not create the whole thing. So yeah, I think there is something there, especially as seen from here. On the other side of it, of course, attitudes towards trade and free trade across the continent are remarkably poor still, despite signing of agreements. The ratification of these agreements and the implementation is so slow. And I think it's a lot to do, again, with local elite interest that want to keep their own protection position and so on. So really championing free trade rather than token signing of agreements, there is actually something there because, you know, this is the continent of the future in that sense, with the youngest population, with where production could in principle come to, you know, imagining value chains that actually are in parts brought in, but that are connected inside Africa. You know, nobody seems to even vaguely talk about that. While this is the normal thing in various Asian countries, including some that don't like each other. And so these things, yeah, there is definitely something. I would agree with you. I don't know how it would be happening, but it's very attitudinal, it's very political, but it's very retrograde, it's very backward-looking. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. Yeah, on a lighter note, I wish you have autographed copies of your book right now. But so, I don't know if I'm going off, but somehow this presentation gives hope, but also I think when you think deep about it, you think like, okay, it doesn't seem like we are going to have any of these conditions or any of this, elite group of people who are interested in development anytime soon, and it doesn't seem like there's really a methodical way to get there. Seems like it's just by chance, and so somehow you can feel hopeless that maybe it might never happen. But when I look at the countries you're giving example, at least some of them, it seems there are some political parties that seem to have a bit more of this interest than others. For example, even the India example you've given, I think the BJP has been in power for most of maybe this period. You haven't given an example of Botswana, for example, but I think it's there in the book that you had on one of your slides. One party has been in power for that period, and I think they have done extremely well. They have changed parties now. We'll see what will happen. I think even in Ethiopia, I think there was one party that was predominantly there, I think until 2019 or something like that. So is there a way in which the citizens or the constituents will be able to identify, and how do these other political organizations seem to pull off this group of people, and can citizens be, I don't know. In short, I'm just trying to find, is there a way that we can be able to identify this and say, hey, this seems better and we want this because this seems to align with what seems to work better?
So 3 points to make there. So the first point is, what surprises me is how many countries have managed to sustain multiple decades of growth in recent times. You wouldn't have had, this is not China, why I emphasized early on, it wasn't just China, it wasn't just India. There's quite a lot of these countries that actually managed to, and this kind of progress is contagious, okay? I was spending a lot of my summer in Pakistan dealing with people senior in government, and the Prime Minister, and, even though they don't like India, we're all the time kind of, but they're surpassing us. So it's contagious, okay? In the pure externalities, also in the expectations externalities is there. But it's also important to know that a lot of countries where it happened, analysts like me and far smarter people like me, than me, they actually wrote these countries off. So Gunnar Myrdal wrote in 1968, he's a Nobel Prize winner, Asian drama person. He wrote in 1968, Indonesia will never develop. 1968, in the mid-70s, it was already really beginning to steam ahead. And he said it's all because it's too corrupt, too much economic governance, too much patronage stuff, all the stuff. And it changed. James Mead, the trade economist, he wrote in the mid-1960s that Mauritius, nothing can ever happen from it. History is so against it. Monoculture in sugar, 3 ethnic groups that totally are divided by class, from the Franco-Mauritians to the Indian indentured labor and then the Bantu population. No way will ever overcome history. Yeah, they had a massive crisis in 1979. They called in the IMF, as so many other countries. By 1985, they were growing at 12-13% per year. Okay? And it was actually political. And now I want to make the other point here. And I should have mentioned, as Henry Kissinger said in the 1970s, that Bangladesh was a basket case. So you get all these places written off where the change is happening. But then the important thing is, it's not about because a single party. Mauritius is an interesting example. They keep on switching between the party. Again, there's a new party coming to power. The previous one has been kicked out. But they keep on switching because there's only 2 surnames that I recognize as presidents since independence. So it's generational within the party. Bangladesh started growing fast when they had transitions of power between the BNP and Sheikh Hasina's party. Ghana started at last growing fast in the period after Jerry Rawlings, when actually the changes started happening. So it's not simply one party. That's why I actually keep on emphasizing it's much more an implicit commitment that we're not going to undo what the other party does. There's certain things we don't touch, and it's a bit like that implicit nature. India, it's interesting because you mentioned the BJP, and it definitely wasn't the BJP, actually. 1991, it was Congress, together in a minority government, and actually realize a minority government does the biggest reforms that India ever saw. A minority government. The left was supporting the government, not as a coalition, but more as we thought at some point, maybe you would have it here, that they would just sustain them in parliament, and so on. What does the left do? Sends all the people on the street demonstrating against the reform agenda. Meanwhile, the left was actually quite forward-looking. They walked out of parliament, so the minority government is suddenly a majority government, and they got the reforms through. They later on admitted in the memoirs that actually they knew very well what they were doing. They knew this had to happen, politics had to be played out, but they found a smart way of playing it out. BJP initially was not very supportive, but by the late 1990s they made it their platform, and now we identify them with it. But that's actually largely, certainly all the parties campaign around growth and development, that was the difference in what it was before. And so that's the thing. So the kind of giving up the hope that you must have this kind of thing, it's much more to do with the implicit thing. And I think that is actually less hard sometimes than it seems, because success breeds success. Once you get going, you can actually keep this going as well. So even in Ethiopia, where there's a fundamental change of government, they know that legacy, that they have to be careful. They need to deliver also on very high growth, because now the expectations, aspirations of everybody is doing it, and the pressure from below is that it needs to be delivered as well. And that's actually about pressure. It's about aspirations and expectations equilibrium, that you do better focus on this and doing it, and then keep the things going. So yeah. So can I exactly say which person will it be? No. And that's by the nature of collective action equilibrium. It's rarely about one leader. Even in Singapore, where everybody says, oh, it is Lee Kuan Yew. If you talk to Singaporean political scientists, they describe him as a great coalition builder. Not as a great leader, but as a great coalition builder. And it's probably more to do with that. Can you get the people who build these coalitions that actually can deliver? Anyway, we can talk more.
Thank you very much. Once again, Ibrahim Okumi is my name, from Makerere University in Uganda. My understanding of this talk is that coalition formation is central to a country's economic status. I have two questions. One is, how can a country's leadership optimize coalition formation to deliver a positive national good? Then the other is, how do you envisage a coalition that is self-cleansing? Thank you.
Yeah, these are very two different, very difficult questions. Okay, so I think let me actually try turn it a little bit around. Like academics or civil society organizations or of others, and in some sense, Nicolau, you were asking me that question about pressures. Okay, there is actually somehow legitimacy of a government tends to respond to expectations of legitimacy, okay? And actually finding ways of being clear about what the nature of legitimacy should be like, that it should include progressing an economy so the pie grows, that actually better services can be provided and so on. I think that's actually what the pressure from below can be, that as the pressure from academics can be from civil society. And you see that can be quite effective. So actually, you create pressures for legitimacy. Or, I've seen it in Pakistan, leaders also desperately keen to be remembered well. Legacies. May sound familiar to you. Legacy is another thing to invoke and put pressure on it and to create ideas and pressures around it that actually post the transition, post the generational transition, that actually the expectations are set that actually need to be around economic progress or something. It's somehow what pressures from below can be. And of course around inclusion and issues to do with that. So yeah, how can you create it? I don't know, but I do know that one way or another pressures from below tend to create virtuous cycles as well. We know from political science evidence that in Ghana and in Kenya, that actually to some extent in the evolution of the politics has been in the last couple of decades, that you do seem to be getting an increased issues-based politics, that people are elected on the expectations on development and the expectation and also on the record of what is being achieved. So there seems to be evidence emerging of that, and that's one of these virtuous processes from below. In each country it will be different because politics will work differently, but it's something like that. But yeah, but these are good questions and I don't give you a proper answer.
One last question.
The last question. Thank you. I've had the privilege of attending this particular conference, I think, twice, and I've listened to the book twice. The last time I wanted to ask that question, but again, I was just before the last person. Today I'm blessed that I'm the last person. Now, just to go back, I think African countries are willing to do everything they have to do to develop. But I think we have inherited very many different circumstances, and one of the trending one is the issue of debt. The political economy of debt is becoming big. I think South Africa is at 73%. Uganda, we are approaching 52%. We are willing, but the issue is it the right time for us to renegotiate these issues that are tracking us back, so that we move forward and we can gamble our own development and achieve it? Thank you.
Really good question, okay? And I will disagree with you on something there. It's where you started. I am not convinced, if I look across sub-Saharan Africa, that every government, as you said, generally wants to grow and develop. Daniel Kaberuka, former finance minister in Rwanda and the former president of the African Development Bank, I thought it was amazing. He was in Washington at one of these international meetings, and he was addressing a series of finance ministers from Africa. And he said very directly to them, for most of you, growth is a choice you don't take. Okay? And there is definitely something that and he was really elaborating and said, look, and I will repeat, I don't see Malawi ever getting Singapore levels of growth. But Malawi can do better if it was generally interested in growth and development. They like growth and development, but they like other things as well. And I don't mean just stealing, it's sometimes just staying in power. It's clientelist politics, creating jobs for your ethnic group, creating jobs for those who keep you in power. You know, these are they're not terrible objectives, but they are mixed objectives. And they're not simply saying, look, we're going to do inclusive growth for the poorest, we're going to get growth going so that the pie grows. No. Mixed objectives of which development is not necessarily the center. Now we come to the political economy of debt. You know, if I go back in that period that I'm describing, if I go back 20 years, actually all the debt was cancelled. So some countries made the choice and other countries didn't. I know Ethiopia has now a debt distress situation, but I have more sympathy with Ethiopia, who generally tried to gamble. Yeah, it was risky, as I was describing. I have more sympathy with Ghana initially, but not with a lot of the Ghanaian debt that was just for political reasons, take out a Eurobond so you could pay the civil servants quickly to win the elections, and then do this twice or three times in a row. Then I say, I have less sympathy. These are political choices. That's the political economy of debt as well. The creation of debt has a political economy, I'm afraid, including in this country, under regimes. Now, but then you're at a particular moment, and then I become sympathetic and say, look, I actually really want to now progress. But I have an inheritance of periods of time, although Ghana may elect the same president again, but let's not go there. But, you know, from periods of time when debt was accumulated, and you now generally want to try to do better, then I'm actually generally sympathetic to do it. But I want then, and I come back, I had it on my last slide, I want signals. I want genuine signals that you're going to try to do. Now, I have a lot of sympathy, actually, for example, in Zambia, with the government and the governor of the central bank. They're trying their very best. They've done very careful negotiations for reschedule. I would say, look, it would be pretty good if Ethiopia can stick to getting a better, better handle on the economy and begin to do it, and also, there's a lot of other political issues there. If they can show signs they're willing, I would be the first one to look for debt cancellation again. I think last time with HIPC, we gave it to everybody, including, I was actually one of the last countries who got it, was Sudan. I was still in DFID, or in the UK government, and it was literally, I remember thinking, wow, this is a great moment. Now we've cancelled all the debt. If I was the military, I would take power again. Yeah, they did a couple of months later. Clean slate, and then you get a war going on. But no debt. Hey, hooray. You want to be thinking about it, but I'm sympathetic to some countries that generally try, and that doesn't mean they sign an IMF deal, by the way, that they're generally trying to deal well with it, and then you can find ways, and then even common framework can help, that you just pause it, and then, with the expectation of cancellation, that's reasonable. But let's not say the political economy of debt is, now we have high debt. No, the political economy of debt started earlier. You accumulated it at moments, some for attempting to develop, and in other cases, just to win electoral cycles. And then I want to be careful. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. We had many more questions online. I want to finish with one last question, and then we finish this extraordinary day. The question is this: we are, in some sense, in this room, and we are part of the elite.
Of course.
In some sense. So therefore, we have to think about what is our role in thinking about this as educators, as members of bureaucracy, as teachers, and as researchers. What is our role in changing the bargaining, for example, in South Africa? With this one, I'll give you the...
And since, sitting in the room, mainly economists or people understand the basic language, so the usual answer is like, I just wrote a paper about that. But actually, I did. But I've been thinking about it. Okay, how do we begin to think about this now in an environment? So what I don't think, I have a lot of respect for our research for the sake of research, okay? So you should not all be relevant to society. But, of course, as you say, we're part of the elite, so there's maybe once in a while a responsibility, because otherwise you keep the status quo as it is. But then it doesn't really help necessarily to just simply give the kind of, oh yes, if we now remove all the distortions, look how good it would look like, without even thinking, where can they start? So I really very much like to think of it as a bit of a principal agent problem as researchers. But unlike what you normally would think, the principal is not the government and with the researcher is the agent. It's actually the other way around. We know there are political constraints. How can we do as good as we can and begin to have steps of progress, taking into account that it has to be feasible in terms of implementation and in terms of politics where you start. So being willing to what I would call politically informed research. So basically saying not that I want to be the mercenary for the status quo, but actually I want to think what is my second best outcome, taking into account that there are certain sets may not be feasible and other things, because I want them, i.e. to participate in the participation constraint to be satisfied, i.e. they may want to do it. And basically to make sure that it is probably a bit better for the people in the status quo as well. That would be the participation constraint. Can we start picking the best one? How do we begin to do? How can we be a bit further? And then the final thing, the paper that I wrote made an appeal to actually a third version, or a further version, a fourth version really. So not be the mercenary, not be the first best, not just be the politically informed advisor, but actually be slightly subversive advisor. And what does it mean? Be willing to take these constraints as endogenous. And to begin to think about, okay, how do I strengthen those groups who generally want change, and how can I weaken? What is the kind of second best economic advice that actually weakens the spoilers and strengthens the ones that actually want to pursue it? Because in the next equilibrium we want to do it. And by the way, as often Daron Acemoglu has a model of that in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 1993, but anyway, or not 2003 or whatever it is, not 2013. But anyway, there's a paper where he talks about, make the political equilibrium endogenous and try to think about how do you begin to do that kind of change in advice And pick your topics then and saying, is this an area where maybe some change is possible and that actually could then strengthen the outcomes? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Be subversive then. Thank you very much. We have, thank you very much.
Thank you, Declan.
We have a little present just to thank you for all the, it's been a 2-hour discussion, it seems.
I'm just
at least
enjoyed.
a little present.
Thank you so much from ERSA side. We are so thrilled that you were going to
Thank you very much.
tonight. We will be having dinner now,
Right.
and I imagine that this can provide us the basis for any conversation we're going to have around that table. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Another round of applause.